What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my best and worst archetypes for all of the classes in Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous, an update to an old video that I did, primarily because as the game has added about 30 different archetypes and an entirely new class since that video almost 2 years ago, with those final updates being added to the game, it made sense to revisit this and update it for people. With that in mind though, a few qualifiers. For starters, if you're only going to be playing the game on normal, then basically every single archetype is viable. You might need to know what you're doing, and some are easier to play than others to be sure, but there aren't any of these that you could not play on that difficulty. Now, as you start moving up into, say, unfair, a lot of things become unviable. But for most people, that's not going to be an issue, so in that context, worst does not mean unplayable. And to that exact point, I would say realistically, the best archetype for you is the one you want to play the most, as it is a video game and frankly not that serious. On the sort of flip side of that argument, however, some classes are so strong by just their very nature that even the worst archetype among them is also still really good, such as for a Kineticist or a Sorcerer. And those are just some things I wanted to share with you that you should be aware of when we go over this list. And as a final note before we actually jump into it, do keep in mind some of this is absolutely subjective and opinion based. But kicking it off right at the top of the list, we have Alchemist. Now, Alchemists are all about throwing their bombs. It's a class pretty unique to Pathfinder, I would say, as it has a lot of fantasy of the setting involved. Alchemists are also casters, however, their casting is using what is called extracts, which means that most of their spells will only affect them unless something about the class specifically says otherwise. But given that they are the only class that uses the bombs anywhere near effectively, it can certainly be an interesting option if you kind of want to try something different. With that in mind, what are the best and worst? Well, in my opinion, the worst is by far the Metamorph. This is because they trade off all of their bombs, that is to say they cannot use them anymore at all, in exchange for being able to, at certain levels, shapeshift into different animals. Now the thing about this is, shapeshifting into animals is generally very underwhelming. It's not something you're going to see a lot of people do because it's simply not up to par with basically everything else you can do. And if you're going to do this, you pretty much want to do it with Brown Fur Transmuter, as they get the best bonuses to turning things into other beasts, etc. As such, a lot of archetypes that focus on that are going to be underwhelming, such as the Metamorph here, which trades off its main class feature for this. Now, in terms of best, I think you have a few options, really. Reanimator, for instance, is fantastic specifically if you want to go into the Lich Mythic path, which is all about, obviously, raising the undead. And this, giving you an extra ability to do that, synergizes with that really, really well. So if I wanted to play an Alchemist and also go Lich, I think this would be the best option. There's also something to be said for Vivisectionist, which trades off its bomb ability in exchange for sneak attack damage, which combined with the mutagen class feature an Alchemist also has, can be pretty fun. But realistically, most people only take that for the dips, which, for my money at least, makes the best option between Grenadier and Incense Synthesizer. Now, Grenadier focuses all in on the bombs, as you might imagine. Mainly, it has an ability called Precise Bomb that means you're not going to be causing splash damage to your allies as an Alchemist, which is a huge deal if you want to play as an Alchemist and not friendly fire your own party to death. But Incense Synthesizer is also really cool because it kind of functions like a bard, except instead of songs and things, you're spreading drugs around to your party, and it makes for an interesting gameplay thing. But personally, I would go Grenadier every time, just for the fact that I wouldn't have to deal with the splash damage, which would get very old very quickly. Which then brings us to Arcanist. Now, might as well get it out of the way. In my opinion, the best Arcanist archetype is Brown Fur Transmuter because it gives a pretty sizable buff to their transmutation spells, which means both their ability to buff other characters using their transmutation spells that don't include transforming anyone are already very, very strong in comparison to everyone else, which makes it pretty much the best buff class that you could pick, but obviously that's not something that's very fun to play for yourself. Now, on the flip side of that, the worst I would say is actually the Unlettered Arcanist. This is because it trades their normal spell list for the Witch spell list, and while I like the Witch spell list, having it without the Witch's Patron, which is their big class feature, makes their spell list pretty underwhelming and simply not worth the trade-off. Now, if you don't want to be buffing other people primarily, I would say the best archetype is then the Eldritch Font, mostly because it trades a couple of the Arcanist's exploits, which are modifications they can make to their spells and the like, or simply spells that they can cast without using up spell slots, that kind of thing, in exchange for Eldritch Surge, which allows you to combine 2 Arcanist exploits into one, increasing both the caster level and the DC of a spell, or simply increasing your effective Arcanist level when using your exploits. Now, this used to not work. They finally fixed it, which makes this really fun, but what you have to watch out for is that when you do this, you can become fatigued or exhausted, which will be a huge hit to some of your stats, but if you combine this with something like a Paladin, which has ways of removing those status effects without actually resting, it can be really, really fun. But that's kind of what Arcanist has going on. As a full arcane caster, though, even just beyond their archetypes, they make a great blaster caster, and as a slightly more interesting way to play a wizard. So even if you're not interested in any one particular archetype of theirs, the base class, which is to say just a regular old Arcanist, you don't have to pick any of these archetypes, can also be a really fun way to play. But that brings us to the Barbarian. Now, the Barbarian is a class that I don't really care for much in Wrath of the Righteous, just because I think it gets overshadowed by so much other stuff, especially in a game where you have things like the Bloodrager. But that said, the worst of its archetypes are, in my opinion, the Armored Hulk. Now, Armored Hulk basically trades off things like their evasion ability and danger sense for resilience of steel and heavy armor training, basically. Now, the problem here is that resilience of steel kind of sucks. It basically gives you extra AC specifically against critical hit confirmations, which basically means you'll take critical hits less often. But the game also has a status effect called Fortification that is just like a flat reduction of criticals that is infinitely better than this. And while this archetype is a little better these days with mythic armor abilities that allow you to make heavy armor more useful than it used to be, it's still just not a great archetype. Now, in terms of best, I think it's a bit of a toss-up between either Mad Dog or Instinctual Warrior. Now, Mad Dog trades off a couple of its rage powers, as well as some of its damage reduction, in exchange for an animal companion. And because animal companions can essentially be their own characters with their own archetype as well, can be a really, really strong addition to any team. An animal companion is often worth its weight, so to speak, in any given party, even on higher difficulties. So giving up things like Uncanny Dodge, for instance, or simply getting your damage reduction a little bit later, and I think Mad Dog is a great archetype. But then you have Instinctual Warrior. Basically, you give up your rage and rage powers for focused rage, which allows you to take on your monk abilities, which are your key powers, which can let you combine a few different things to make that class more interesting. And given that you also get Cunning Illusion, which allows you to add your wisdom bonus to AC, you can do some fun stuff there. But given that I don't like monks, for me, it's Mad Dog all the way. But that brings us to Bard. I don't think I need to really explain what a Bard is to anybody, but in general, this class is all about buffing up your allies and being able to cast some spells at the same time, and they can make a useful support role in your party. Now, for me, the worst Bard archetype is Beast Tamer. That is because they effectively trade off a few of their big AoE buffs for the ability to summon in a lot of stuff. Now, the problem here is that summoning in general isn't that great, especially the higher up in difficulty you go. And in order to make it useful at all, it's a very high cost in terms of things like feats and whatnot that you have to pick up to make your summons worth anything. And while very, very playable on things like normal difficulty, in general, summoning isn't just strong enough to make this worth it, frankly. Now, in terms of your best archetype, I would definitely still say this is the Dirge Bard, specifically because they get an ability called Secrets of the Grave at level 2 that allows their mind-affecting spells and the like to affect the undead, which as a 2-level dip can be pretty handy if you want to do something in particular, given that there is a fair bit of undead enemies in this particular game. However, the recently added Chalaxian Diva is also pretty interesting, but my hang-up with this one would be playing it on higher difficulties because the Diva here trades off a bunch of its AoE buffs for AoE debuffs to the enemy, such as the Tragedy of False Hope, forcing enemies to become flat-footed, which will cause them to have reduced AC and also take sneak attack damage, which is great, but a successful will save from your enemies will prevent this, and because of the way the DC is calculated there, against higher level enemies, especially on higher difficulties, you're going to have a hard time actually getting this debuff through. And while it's not impossible, that would be my main concern with it. Moving right along though, we then have Bloodrager, which is a combination of Sorcerer and Barbarian, and I would say a whole lot more interesting than both, though certainly Sorcerer is quite strong indeed. The Bloodrager as a concept, however, is just really kind of neat. Instead of their sorceress lineage giving them spells and the like, they instead apply it to their rage abilities, or their blood rage, which is going to give you the abilities of your bloodline ability, on top of some extra feats and the like, to make for a combination that is fun to mess around with, albeit with the caveat that you kind of know what you're doing. Now, in terms of worst, I would say Green Rager. You don't trade off much. You just pick up a bunch of summon spells, which, as I've already mentioned, aren't particularly strong without a huge investment, and you don't get enough of them here to even bother making that investment. But in terms of best, I think you have a few different options. There's Bloodrager, which trades off just a couple of things like Uncanny Dodge in exchange for an animal companion at level 4. Has to be a horse, though. And as discussed, animal companions are quite strong. And then there's things like the Mixed Bloodrager, which once per day allows you to pick the bloodline you would like to use for that day, allowing you to effectively gain access to all of them, which would be my personal pick just because you don't lose anything for taking it. Then, however, we have the Cs, specifically with the Cavalier. Now, the Cavalier is your sort of mounted combat class. If you want to do mounted combat specifically, this is probably the class you'll pick. It's quite strong and for good reason. Basically everything it does leans into that in some way. So for its weakest archetype, the Standard Bearer, it's perhaps no surprise then that it moves away from that, giving up its two best abilities, really the charge abilities it gets at level 11 and then 20, allowing it to add more and more extra damage to the charge damage in exchange for the ability to put up a banner to buff your allies with an incredibly weak buff to things like their attack rolls. It just makes it not worth it at all. Terrible archetype, to be honest. But in terms of best, I would say it's a toss-up between Cavalier of the Paw and I believe it's Gendarme, though I'm sure someone will tell me it's wrong. Now, Cavalier of the Paw is really cool, and it's probably the only racial archetype that's worth much. That is to say, you are required to be a certain playable race here. In this particular case, halflings. So you have to pick a dog or a wolf, which are already quite good. And then as you level up at level 8, for instance, you'll get bonuses to your combat maneuvers alongside bonus combat feats. And then later on at level 15, bonuses to larger enemies as well, which there are a lot of in this game. So it makes a ton of sense to play that. Very doable. But Gendarme trades off probably the worst class feature of the Cavalier, which is Tactician, in exchange for a ton more bonus feats. And it also, at level 20, makes their big charge ability even better than normal, which is just crazy. In terms of raw damage, hard to do much better for the Cavalier. But that brings us to Cleric. Now, Clerics, as full divine casters utilizing different domains to get most of their class abilities, makes for an incredibly versatile class. Basically, no matter what kind of Cleric you're playing, depending on the domains that you picked up, they can play very, very differently, which means their individual domains are very important to them. Which is probably no surprise then that the worst archetype I would say is Herald Caller, which gives up an entire domain in exchange for the ability to use your channel energy ability to instead summon in summoning spells that you hadn't prepared ahead of time. But again, summoning just really isn't worth it, and you're going to have to invest a ton of your feats into this to make it worthwhile, which means it's not really worth it, at least to my mind. Now, in terms of best, I would probably say Angel Fire Apostle, which, while having to deal with diminished spellcasting, that is to say getting a few less spells per level, goes all in on its channel positive energy ability, which is required for this class, but basically, as they level up, their channel positive energy becomes stronger and stronger, eventually being able to do things like straight up resurrect your fallen companions with the resurrection spell, which is crazy strong. And given that you would normally relegate those things to spell slots you would have to use up to do this, this can basically make you a dedicated healer while at the same time utilizing the rest of your actual spell slots for things you actually want to cast that aren't simple heals. Very, very cool archetype, but hardly the only one of interest. Another one that's actually really cool is Priest of Balance, which sees you alternating back and forth between channeling positive and negative energy to strengthen the next one you cast, which is kind of a neat way to play a cleric if you're up for something a little different. But that brings us to Druid. Druids are also full divine casters, but also they have an emphasis on transforming into animals, which isn't honestly very strong, but their spell list is really what they're all about. Now, the worst Druid archetype isn't even so much a bad archetype as it just doesn't have a place in this particular game, and that is Defender of the True World. Basically, this archetype is all about giving you bonuses to hunting down fey creatures, which, while very useful in the game's predecessor, Kingmaker, which had a lot of fey creatures, it's essentially useless here in this particular game, which has almost none. And while still useful in the sense that it's a full divine caster, the primary bonuses of this archetype are effectively useless. Now, in terms of best archetype, though, there's a lot of ways you could go with that. For instance, the Blight Druid's going to force you to pick up a domain instead of an animal companion, while also letting you pick up a few specific domains you would not normally get access to that are going to give you access to different spells, which could make for a great potential sort of blaster caster style of play. As a full divine caster, very viable way to approach the game, and given that they can merge their spellbook with a mythic spellbook to get level 10 spells, could be really strong. But then there's stuff like the recently added Winter's Child, which allows you to take on an ice elemental or a blizzard elemental as your companion rather than a typical animal companion, which is going to get unique buffs like the ability to deal ice damage to anything that hits it, and then later on at max level you could even potentially gain complete immunity to cold and even ground-based effects. So that one's pretty neat as well, but for my money I'd probably go Blight Druid. But then we have the most generic class of them all, which is your standard fighter. Now, honestly, very reliable all-around class. They do very solid damage. They have a high base attack bonus, great proficiencies even, so they can do a lot of stuff, which is why like half of this class and its archetypes are actually just setups for different prestige classes, like the Aldori Defender goes into Aldori Swordlord real well, Armiger rolls right into Hell Knight, or you can use Dragonair Scion to go into Dragon Disciple or something like that. But what's the worst and what's the best? Well, frankly, I think Dragonair Scion's honestly not very good, unless you are specifically picking it up to go into Dragon Disciple, which is probably going to be a mostly roleplay thing anyway. It's a bit of a letdown because in exchange for a bloodline, you're giving up armor training, several extra combat feats, bravery, and your level 20 weapon mastery. All in exchange for something like Arcane Strike, basically, which just isn't very good. It's a lot to give up for not very much in return, frankly. Now, in terms of best fighter archetype, if you're going like all in on fighter, I would say probably Mutation Warrior, because then you're just giving up some of your armor training for Mutagen, the Alchemist class feature that allows you to pick up bonuses to a physical stat at the detriment to a mental stat. And then later on, starting at like level 7, you can pick up Mutagen Discoveries, some of which are very, very strong. And let's be honest, it'll make you feel like The Witcher. But the recently added Titan Fighter is also a pretty interesting one, as it's going to allow you to dual wield two-handed weapons. Now, the catch to this one is that you're losing both armor training as well as weapon training. But basically, in exchange for some defensive ability, you'll be able to dual wield two-handed weapons, which could be really, really good, especially if you lean into the mythic armor abilities to make up for some of that lost armor training, as an example. So either of those, I think, would be quite good. But then we have the Hunter. Now, the Hunter is a bit of a mix between Ranger and Druid, and overall, it's a weird class, frankly. There's just no other way around it. But it did actually wind up getting a buff, because the Hunter, as a broad class, wasn't very good for a long time because of Animal Focus. Animal Focus allowing you to buff either your animal companion or yourself, granting you some bonuses. But the problem with this is that for a long time that didn't actually stack with equipment. It was the same type of bonus, meaning it wasn't very good, but now it will stack. So this class is a little better than it used to be, just flatly across the board. But as you might have guessed, Hunter is basically all about maximizing your animal companion. but unfortunately, a fair few of its archetypes are just a bit underwhelming, quite frankly. But the worst of them all, I would say, was the Forester, because it took a class that was based entirely around its animal companion and removes the animal companion in exchange for a handful of bonus combat feats and the favored terrain stuff from being a ranger. So all in all, just not a good archetype at all. The terrain bonuses are not nearly significant enough to make up for that, and it's really not worth it. On the flip side of that, Hunter also has an amazing archetype in the form of Divine Hound. Divine Hound is really, really good. So unfortunately, you don't get to pick any animal companion you want. Rather, you have to pick a dog or a wolf. However, in exchange for that and the loss of animal focus, you get Inquisitor's Judgment abilities, which are going to be able to give you bonuses almost exactly like animal focus, as well as a few others, which is pretty strong in and of itself, especially because you'll be able to stack them at a certain point. All of which are shared with your animal companion and yourself. And that, combined with your regular old tactician abilities, makes the Divine Hound Hunter a tremendous archetype. If you're going to play Hunter, realistically, it's the way to go. But speaking of judgments, next up we have the Inquisitor. So the Inquisitor is one of my favorite classes as it does a whole lot of stuff. Basically, it gets one domain like a Cleric, albeit a max level of spells at level 6, but we also get those judgments I just mentioned on top of their Bane ability, which basically just gives them flat extra damage to whatever it is they're doing, which on its own already a pretty cool class, a lot of flavor. And then we get into the actual archetypes, all of which can be pretty strong, as Inquisitor is one of those classes where even the worst of it is pretty good. But if I had to pick a worst one, it would almost certainly be Monster Tactician, because you're giving up those judgments for summoning, which as we've been over a few times just isn't very good, whereas the judgments are quite good. But when it comes to talking about the best Inquisitor archetype, well, then it becomes much more difficult, frankly, as the Inquisitor has a lot of really good ones, like Sacred Huntsmaster, for instance, that drops some of your judgments, but also allows you to pick up an animal companion on top of the favorite enemy mechanic from the Ranger class. Then you have stuff like Sanctified Slayer that drops the judgment ability for instead sneak attack damage, and the Slayer's Studied Target, which is going to give them bonuses roughly equivalent to what you probably would have picked up with judgments anyway, which could be really strong on top of its Bane ability. Which is why, for me at least, I would say Sanctified Slayer is probably the best one overall, but most of them are very good. Then we have Kineticist. Kineticist is very different from basically every other class in this game. I made an entire video discussing specifically how to play a Kineticist, and almost all of these archetypes are capable of being very good. With one exception, and that's basically Kinetic Knight. And to be honest with you could play a Kinetic Knight and be perfectly fine. It is nonetheless kind of just a straight downgrade from the base Kineticist, provided of course you actually know what you're doing. But essentially, Kineticists use elemental forces to form blasts of kinetic energy, which can be elemental in nature, and using their powers they can shape it into different forms, such as a blade or various infusions to turn it into like a wall or a different type of blast, etc. And Kinetic Knight is all about trying to do that in a melee-oriented fashion. But the problem is, the archetype actually gives up things like Metakinesis, which allows the regular Kineticist to maximize their damage. And the thing is, the base Kineticist can pick up the melee infusions that allow them to do what a Kinetic Knight does without giving up Metakinesis, which is just better, frankly. Now, the Kinetic Knight does also pick up proficiencies with medium and heavy armor, which could be compelling, especially with the mythics that now add bonuses to heavy armor in particular, bringing it up to par. But my issue here really is just that you can also get a really high AC in unarmored or light armor, and giving up one of your main abilities to maximize your damage is not worth the trade-off. So in my opinion, Kinetic Knight is the weakest of all of these archetypes. Now when you're talking about strongest, that's a little bit different, especially because it depends on how you want to play. So in terms of just raw damage, Elemental Engine. This archetype goes all in on the glass cannon nature of the entire class, because as they cast their blast, they take on burn, which eats into their max health. Elemental Engine is all about keeping yourself at maximum burn to deal extra damage on all of your kinetic blasts with every point of burn that you have via their burnout ability. So if you want damage, Elemental Engine is basically it. However, because they're dealing with maximum burn, their ability to mitigate the burn cost of the blast that they're using is important, which is where the Gather Power mechanic for the class comes in, which means the wind-up on some of those attacks is going to be a bit high, which is where something like the new archetype Kinetic Sharpshooter comes in. Kinetic Sharpshooter allows you to use their Kinetic Quiver ability to basically pre-prepare your blasts by eliminating the Gather Power mechanic for this archetype altogether. They use Kinetic Quiver and a bow to activate their blasts instead of Gather Power, which means they attack more often. Now the trade-off here is that Kinetic Sharpshooter gets less infusions overall, or ways to change their blasts, with most of the really good stuff specific to the archetype not coming until much later at like level 17. So Sharpshooter is easier to play and also capable of attacking faster and in more bursts, but doesn't really come into its own until much, much later than just say a base Kineticist. So a lot of stuff to know in terms of that archetype in particular, but there you go. But then we have the Magus, your Gish character, utilizing both magic and melee, exemplified through their spell combat abilities. Basically, they can cast spells and wield their weapons at the same time in a manner similar to two-weapon fighting. And then later on, at level 2 with Spell Strike, they can actually cast a spell through their weapon as part of their melee attacks, which can do some interesting stuff overall. And this one has archetypes that play around with giving you armor or an animal companion, the usual stuff, but by far the worst is Spelldancer. This is an elf racial specific archetype, and basically it gives up all of the class's arcane pool, which is what allows them to use various buffs to their individual weapons to maximize damage off of the main thing they're going for, and instead having to use it specifically for things like movement and dodge bonuses to AC against attacks of opportunity, as an example. And it's definitely a case of trading off like a main class feature for something more akin to a gimmick that could be easily outpaced by just spells or scrolls even in the case of this game. So terrible archetype overall. But then we have the best of the best, and that is, and continues to be, the Sword Saint Magus. Sword Saint is incredible. Basically, in exchange for things like the medium and heavy armor you would normally get as a Magus, Sword Saints choose a martial or exotic weapon right at level 1 to be their chosen weapon. And then, when using that weapon, they get all sorts of bonuses like, say, Perfect Strike, which allows them to maximize weapon damage, or Perfect Critical, which allows them to increase their critical multiplier, or how much damage they're dealing. And then at level 20, any attack they make that would critical is guaranteed to critical if they roll in their range for it. Though realistically, most people don't usually put all 20 levels into this, but rather combine it with things like Duelist for its precise strike ability to add more damage, or picking up parry, or things like that. So basically, Sword Saint can deal a tremendous amount of damage, but with that in mind, it is a little bit complicated to play, so it's not exactly one that's great for beginners. But if you're good with that, Sword Saint is an incredible archetype. Which then brings us to Monk. Now, Monk is an interesting one because the reason most people used to use it was for the Scaled Fist archetype's Charisma to AC. That is to say, they would use their Charisma bonus to AC, and then that would actually stack with an Oracle's Mystery that did the same thing. But that has actually been fixed and it doesn't work anymore, which means overall you don't see people talk about this as much as they used to. That said, Monk is still capable of being a lot of fun, all on its own, albeit for different reasons. Now, in terms of your worst archetype, that is still Student of Stone, the Oread racial archetype, and basically you trade off things like evasion, as well as some of your key powers and bonus feats, in exchange for some defensive abilities, as well as the ability to deal acid damage with their fist attacks. And overall, just not a super useful archetype, especially when there are simply better options available. Such as the recently added Drunken Master, which is going to allow you to create and consume alcohol to give you all sorts of bonuses to your unarmed attacks, which they also still get access to. So that one's really great. There's also Zen Archer, which is a really fantastic archery archetype, but given that we get a companion that already has this one, you're unlikely to use it for yourself. But one of my favorites is actually Sohei, and this is because they get both an animal companion on top of picking up weapon training to make them more interesting overall, and a selection of different bonus feats. So Sohei's a really cool one. But let's keep it moving. Then we have Oracle, another full divine caster that makes a fantastic healer, but is a little complicated to play because oracles deal with a mystery and a curse. A mystery acting almost as a domain, and then a curse offering some sort of drawback typically, which makes each individual oracle a somewhat unique class to play, especially when we start talking about archetypes. But in terms of the worst, I would say for me it's probably Wind Whisperer. Mostly just because it doesn't really do anything, it just kind of forces you to take the Wind Mystery, which comes with a set selection of spells and the like, but also, in place of revelations you would normally pick, you have two set in stone ones that act as a haste spell, and then a freedom of movement spell, and there's just frankly easier ways to get these, so realistically you could just pick a base oracle, pick up the Wind Mystery, and then also have your selection of other more useful revelations, so it's just not very useful overall, as it turns out. But in terms of best, that really depends on you. For instance, if you wanted to go fully into their full caster abilities, you could go with the Seeker, which is going to give you some extra bonus feats specifically related to spell casting, which isn't a bad way to go. Or if you wanted to lean more fully into their healing, you could sacrifice a Revelation for a couple abilities that allow you to heal without actually utilizing spells, for instance. With the rest of the Oracle archetypes kind of just being some measure of okay. They're not bad, but they're also not incredible or anything. Which then brings us to Paladin. So Paladin, given the adventure path we're on and how well it fits into the entire theme and everything, is almost certainly going to be in every party, given that our very first companion, Seela, is in fact a Paladin. Moreover though, because we're fighting demons and everything, they have a lot of great bonuses to combat exactly that. That said, I don't think Paladins are really at the top of the food chain at basically anything, but they have a handful of abilities that make them incredibly useful because of what we're doing. In terms of the worst, again, our racial archetypes strike with the Dwarven one, Stone Lord. Basically, this sees you giving up one of your main class features in the form of Smite Evil in exchange for effectively damage reduction and the like, which to my mind simply isn't worth the trade-off. But in terms of best, we have a few different options, I would say, mostly depends on what you want. Such as Divine Scion, which trades off Smite Evil for Studied Target, which is going to be in use more often, especially when you start picking up the extra sneak attacks, which as a Paladin makes for some interesting exchanges. So this trades off a main class feature, but for something equally as good, if not a little better. Then you have Divine Hunter, which instead of the typical melee abilities, instead picks up a bow. But Scion would definitely be my pick here. Getting towards the end of the list now, we then have Ranger. Ranger is one of those, I would say, iconic classes at this point that doesn't need much of an introduction. And with its favored enemy ability, allowing us to focus on the main enemy at play in this adventure path via demons, can have some really strong effects on the battlefield, which is why, starting with the strongest archetype this time, it's easily Demon Slayer, but it's actually a little better than it initially seems because of how this game handles demons. Typically speaking, when playing a ranger and selecting demons as your favorite enemy, you would just pick evil outsiders. However, Wrath of the Righteous here has those demons divided up into 3 categories. A normal ranger would have to pick one of these 3 different categories, whereas Demon Slayer gets bonuses for all 3 every time they pick up favorite enemy, which means they get huge bonuses to hit demons and the damage they do to those demons, on top of the ability to pick up an animal companion at level 4 if they want. So, Demon Slayer gets the benefit of being one of the easiest ways to play this game with one of the most effective archetypes. But with that in mind, let's talk about what the worst one is. Well, I would have to say Flame Warden, personally, and this is because a lot of their abilities deal fire damage, basically, and they're giving up their Divine Bond and thus their animal companion in exchange for this. But the thing is, because we're mostly up against demons, which are going to have resistance to fire, in order for this to deal a substantial amount of damage, you'd have to pick up Ascendant Element Fire as a mythic ability, which is only going to apply to about 3 or 4 of your abilities as a ranger. which means in order to make use of this, you'd effectively have to give up one of your precious mythic ability slots, which just simply wouldn't be worth it, especially given that you're giving up an animal companion for this. Now, before we move on from Ranger, I want to talk a little bit about the new archetype Sable Company Marine, because while I don't think it's the strongest Ranger archetype just because of how good Demon Slayer is, this is the only archetype that lets you pick up a Hippogriff companion, and it gets some unique abilities that you can't get anywhere else, and is thus really cool. But that brings us to Rogue. Now, I'll be real, in a game that does not have extremely good stealth mechanics, even if they are there, Rogues can be a little bit underwhelming, but luckily sneak attack damage is relatively easy to get because of the way this game handles flanking, which basically means just two people have to be next to each other near an enemy for it to count as flanking, so it's very easy to do. Nonetheless though, if we're talking worst archetype, in my opinion that's Master of All, basically because you're giving up sneak attack damage in exchange for a skill focus, which basically allows you to go all in on a particular skill, like say lockpicking or something. But given that you could realistically just save scum your way through that or have a wide selection of party members available to do these things for you, you're basically losing sneak attack damage in exchange for something that's not particularly useful outside of just a little bit of convenience, which in my opinion simply isn't worth the trade-off. But it's somewhat tied, I would say, for Underground Chemist as well being the worst one, and this is because Underground Chemist sees you losing evasion as well as 2 rogue talents in exchange for the ability to chuck thrown alchemical items like alchemical fire or something like that and deal sneak attack with the splash damage from that. But that is incredibly niche and not very useful because that would also be hurting your companions if it hit them, and in most cases you'd be better off just doing regular sneak damage, so that's also not a good one. Now in terms of best, you have a few options, but none of them are particularly amazing. So Eldritch Scoundrel is, I would say, the natural inclination a lot of people will make. Basically give up a little bit of sneak attack damage in exchange for some spell casting and a few less rogue talents. But spells can make up for a lot of what you're losing there, so that makes sense. But one of our early companions is an Eldritch Scoundrel, so you probably won't pick this for yourself. So in terms of best, I would say Knife Master, mostly because we're simply losing Danger Sense for an increase to our knife damage, as well as increased AC against light weapons specifically, or light blades if you prefer. So this kind of sees you maximizing the type of damage a rogue is most likely to do in this game anyway, which is great. Now there is a shout out to Rowdy I can make here as well. Rowdy is an incredible early few levels because they get a bunch of additional damage per sneak attack when using Vital Strike. But the problem with Vital Strike is that it is a single attack, meaning that if you miss, you don't really do anything that turn, so it falls off a little bit after the first few levels, but it is very good. Then we have Shaman, one of, I would say, the trickier classes to play overall, just because it kind of does a lot of different things, including hexes, full divine spell casting, and some other interesting class mechanics you don't see much of anywhere else. As such, a lot of people don't play a ton of these, and what I consider the best archetype is also the one they gave to an early game companion in the form of Camellia, with Spirit Hunter giving you bonuses to your weapon specifically in exchange for the temporary bonds you can make with spirits, which is a decent exchange. Now, given that you're not likely to use that one because of our companion, I would say the next best is Shadow Shaman, which loses its Wandering Spirit bonds as well as 1 hex in exchange for a bunch of sneak attack damage, which can make for a really interesting character, especially if you lean all the way into its divine spell casting in combination with like the Angel Mythic Path, which is a build I myself actually made a build video for a while back, just as an example. Now, an interesting but a little niche option is the new Prophet of Pestilence archetype. This sees you, instead of bonding with a specific spirit, bonding with a pestilence spirit, which is going to allow you to utilize the Plague of Abaddon at 2nd level. Basically, you can try to inflict enemies with the plague, and specifically, you'll get the ability to pick a specific mutation that the plague takes on, allowing you to inflict specific conditions via a hex on certain enemies, provided they fail a fortitude save, which is my main hang-up about it, but it's a very cool concept, especially for a shaman. But with that said, what's the worst one? Well, basically I would say the Unsworn Shaman. Essentially, you trade every single hex your character is going to get, which is your primary class mechanic as a shaman that isn't just like regular old spell casting, in exchange for not having to commit to a particular spirit. Spirits being responsible for a bunch of your spells and abilities and hexes, kind of in a similar fashion to a sorcerer's bloodline. But basically with an Unsworn Shaman, you don't pick a spirit and instead make temporary bonds with all sorts of ones at the cost of all of your hexes, which is just a crazy trade-off that isn't really worth it. But then we have a brand new class to talk about, which is the Shifter, a martially focused druid class that was not in the game the last time I made this list, so this should be pretty interesting. But basically the Shifter is all about transforming into animals, but it actually being useful. So instead of using the typical beast shapes and the like that realistically only a brown fur transmuter would be good at, we instead have the ability to modify both of our claws as well as our overall aspect to focus on dealing a ton of physical damage via one of a few different forms our character can take. Very cool class, one of my favorites, a lot of cool stuff going on. With that in mind, in terms of the best, in terms of just raw damage, I would say the Fey Form Shifter, because they get things like sneak attack damage as well as a few rogue talents in particular that really push it over the top in terms of damage. But realistically, you might want to pick one of the other archetypes, such as the Child of the Manticore, for their ability to do this at ranged instead of in melee, which is a pretty nice option. But if I had to pick a worst one, it would probably be Wild Effigy. This is basically because it just focuses on defensive features instead. So theoretically, you would take less damage, but that's pretty much it. That's all it does. Which certainly isn't terrible, but that's just because Shifter is one of those classes where all of them are honestly pretty good in their own ways. Which brings us to Skald. Skald is all about inspiring rage in others, combining a barbarian and a bard to make for a pretty unique class. They're also quite strong with their ability to cast spells and get all sorts of other abilities, such as rage powers, Skald talents, and even some bonus feats. So very good class all around, but naturally there's gotta be a worst archetype, which in my opinion is Hunt Caller. This is because it drops some of your rage powers and a few of your songs actually in exchange for Call of the Wild, which allows you to transform into beast, which as we've mentioned many times is simply not very useful. But in terms of best, basically I think it comes down to Court Poet or Demon Dancer. Court Poet is really cool because of its insightful contemplation ability, which allows you to inspire rage in essentially spellcasters instead of the typical melee, which is a bit of a flip on the concept that is basically only available to the Court Poet, which is pretty cool. But then we have the Demon Dancer. They give up their rage powers in exchange for a bunch of natural attacks, and I actually made a build for this myself that I used for Unfair even, that allows you to stack just a ton of natural attacks, and it can be a ton of fun. So for me, I'd say one of those two. Which brings us to Slayer, another tremendous class overall. Very easy to play, most of its stuff happens passively as it attacks things via studied target, providing bonuses as it applies when they deal sneak attack damage. Now, the worst archetype here is always going to be Imitator for me. They lose all of their studied target, half of their sneak attack damage, and some of their movement things later on, in exchange for Imitation, which allows them to take on a stance of fighter, barbarian, rogue, or monk to get some different bonuses, none of which, in my opinion, are worth the trade-off of everything they lose to get it, though I do know some people enjoy it. Now, in terms of best, I definitely think it is Deliverer. This is because they lose 2 of their Slayer talents, which are usually going to give you things like either rogue talents or combat feats, and they instead pick up Determined Zeal, and then later on Divine Anathema. And Divine Anathema allows any target that is 2 steps away from your own alignment to simply take more damage from you. And because pretty much everything we fight in this game is going to be chaotic evil, that's very easy to set up essentially guaranteed damage on top of an already very strong class, which in a somewhat similar manner to Demon Slayer makes for a class that's just really easy and straightforward to play. But then we have the Sorcerer. So Sorcerer is one of those classes you just can't really go wrong with. Every one of these archetypes is tremendous in its own way, but unsurprisingly, the weakest is pretty much always going to be its racial archetype, which in this case is Nine-Tailed Heir for the Kitsune. In particular, though, while they do still pick a bloodline, they don't get any additional spells from that bloodline. Instead, when they would get those spells, they get the magical tail feat available to all Kitsune that gives them a new spell in order each time they take it. And honestly, a lot of them are just kind of out of order, or by the time you get them, they're not useful anymore, which makes for a sorcerer that's not very fun to play, in my opinion. Now, in terms of best, I usually like either Cross-Blooded or Seeker. Cross-Blooded allows you to take fewer spells known in exchange for a second bloodline that only gives you the spells from that bloodline, so it kind of evens out in the end if you want a nice, robust spell selection instead of the usual. Seeker, on the other hand, allows you to pick up a bunch of extra spellcasting feats that are going to, of course, give you just more feats in general to pick, which can help mitigate some of the need to pick up all the various meta magic feats, which is otherwise a bit of a hassle. So I like it for that, if nothing else. That brings us to Warpriest, though. Warpriest is an odd duck of a class. It combines Cleric and Fighter, but alters both of them a little bit. So instead of weapon training, they get things like Sacred Weapon, and instead of domains, they get blessings, which are similar, but a little bit different. Combine that with their only 6th level spells, and you've got a class that I don't think a lot of people are going to play much, especially on higher difficulties. But let's talk worst archetype. In this case, I think it is, of course, Feral Champion, because that sacrifices a bunch of our bonuses and both of our blessings for the privilege of turning into a few different animal shapes, which, as we've discussed many times, is simply not very good. So easily the worst of the worst. Now, in terms of best archetypes, I would say this is actually the recently added Mantis Zealot, because in exchange for a few of the bonus combat feats the Warpriest would get, they instead get things like saber fighting, allowing them to pick up a bunch of combat feats anyway, specifically for the recently added Sawtooth saber weapons. And then right at level 1, they pick up Red Shroud, which allows them to surround themselves with a whole swarm of mantises that are going to give them bonuses to their AC and fast healing. At level 4, they can even start dealing damage to people around you. At level 7, they make you partially concealed, which means there's a 20% chance to just avoid anything that would otherwise hit you. And it's a really cool, flavorful way to play an otherwise unremarkable class. Which brings us to the Witch. Now, witches are similar to shamans in that they use hexes, but they are also bound to a patron. The patron granting them spells and a familiar through which they get their spell casting, the familiar providing its own bonuses, of course, which makes for a really interesting spell casting class. In particular, though, one of our companions, Ember, is a stigmatized witch, and she can be turned into one of the game's best blaster casters very easily, which is a reason you might want to play this for yourself. But let's talk about what you shouldn't play, which is Hagbound. Basically, you trade a bunch of your hexes for Hunched Muscle, which gives you bonuses to your strength score, except this is a caster class that cannot really use anything weapon or armor wise, so getting strength bonuses to that is kind of useless, especially at the cost of a very specific patron that you have to pick from one of 4 choices. Basically, you're giving up too much for bonuses that don't even really apply to what you're doing, and in general, it's not really a good idea as a result. I'm also not fond of Elemental Witch, as that only sees you trading off a bunch of hexes for a ray attack, which isn't great, but can theoretically be used for more than Hagbound will, which is why I like it less. But probably the best, and the one I would play personally, is the Hag of Garona, one of the new archetypes for the Witch, which trades just a few of your hexes, 3 to be specific, for some pretty wild bonuses. Basically, instead of a patron, you form a pact with a Night Hag, which gives you the standard handful of spells, but also a few bonuses as you level up, including increasing the save DCs of your fear descriptor spells, like say Phantasmal Killer, for instance. And then eventually, at level 12, the Night Hag will actually start to follow you around as a companion, but the Night Hag also knows a bunch of spells that they can cast at will, such as like Haste at level 14, and then other stuff that only gets better as you go. And the fact that they can cast them at will in some cases saves you from having to cast them and thus your spell slots, while at the same time increasing what you are capable of doing in combat, which makes this just an incredibly cool archetype. But that finally brings us to our final entry, which is the Wizard. Now the thing to understand about the Wizard is that while they can cast a ton of different spells, they have to pick opposition schools, which are basically schools of magic that will take up more of their spell slots if they try to cast them than they normally would. And that's important when you talk about best and worst archetypes and understanding how things work here, because the worst archetype, in my opinion, is by far the Arcane Bomber, because typically, as a wizard, you either give up choosing a specialist school, which gives you bonuses based on the school, or you have to take more opposition schools. So Arcane Bomber, you have to take 4 opposition schools for the great privilege of throwing bombs. And honestly, you're not going to be very good at throwing these bombs. They're definitely not going to do nearly as much damage as just using a spell would, and thus it makes the fact that I would take on a bunch of opposition schools to just throw bombs that I would likely be playing an Arcanist for anyway, a very bizarre choice overall. But if that's the worst, then what is the best? Well, you have some options there. I think most of the other archetypes are actually pretty good. For instance, you could pick the kind of Dampier archetype here that sees you doing Necromancy as a specialist school, while also allowing you to use blood infusions with those necromancy spells, so if that's what you want to do, that's great. Elemental Specialist is great at honing in on a specific type of element they want to use, which in combination with the mythic abilities that allow you to bypass resistances, and just their general spells, makes it incredibly powerful if you just want a blaster cast. Exploiter Wizard, on the other hand, doesn't see you picking up a specialist school at all, but lets you pick up an Arcanist's exploits in what is, in many ways, just a straight upgrade for a wizard overall. So best is definitely subjective when it comes to the wizard. Personally, I would pick Exploiter for myself. That is pretty much going to wrap up this video and a look at what I consider the best and worst archetypes for all of these, and some more information regardless, accounting for the new archetypes added from all the DLCs, the new class that was added, which is finally a nice place to wrap up this relatively long video. So I certainly hope you enjoyed it. Do absolutely let me know what you think about all of this down in the comment section below. What are your favorite archetypes? What do you prefer to play for one reason or another? I'm definitely interested in hearing all about it, so don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. But regardless of all that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.